Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden met in San Francisco for their first face-to-face meeting in a year. Both sides have made positive comments on the meeting, calling the talks candid, comprehensive, and in-depth. What more do we know about the summit? What's next for China-U.S. relations? And what are the major issues threatening smooth ties between the two powers? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Dr. Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies of the National Institute for Global Strategy, Professor Warwick Powell from the Queensland University of Technology, who is also the chairman of Smart Trade Networks, and Sourabh Gupta, Resident Senior Fellow of the Institute for China-America Studies. Before we start our discussion, let's take a look at a clip first.
President Joe Biden welcomed President Xi Jinping upon his arrival at Filoli Estate. It was their first meeting in a year since they last met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. In opening remarks, President Xi underscored his long-standing view that cooperation between the world's two largest economies will benefit both their peoples and the rest of the world. President Xi said the world is big enough for the two countries to succeed.
My view is consistent, which is that major country competition is not a prevailing trend of current times and cannot solve the problems facing China and the United States or the world at large. Planet Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed, and one country's success is an opportunity for the other.
The Chinese president proposed building together 5 pillars for better bilateral ties. First, developing a right perception of each other, so the two countries can coexist in mutual respect and peace. Second, managing disagreements and untoward incidents effectively through calm, frequent communication. Third, advancing mutually beneficial cooperation, not just in traditional areas like trade, but in emerging and urgent issues such as climate change and artificial intelligence. Fourth, shouldering responsibilities as major countries by stepping up coordination and cooperation on international and regional issues. Fifth, promoting people-to-people exchanges. For his part, President Biden said it was important to keep the two countries' competition in check and called for joint efforts to tackle common challenges.
We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict, and we also have to manage it responsibly. That competition. That's what the United States wants and what we intend to do. I also believe it's what the world wants for both of us, candid exchange. We also have a responsibility to our people and the world to work together when we see it in our interest to do so.
The two presidents agreed to resume high-level military-to-military communication on the basis of equality and respect. They also agreed to increase passenger flights between the U.S. and China by early next year, and to expand exchanges in various sectors.
Thank you.
Okay, Zhao Hai, we'll start with you. So we are going to see the significant increase of direct flights and obviously the cooperation on fentanyl and other military channel of discussion between the two sides. So when you look back at the outcome of the summit meeting, are those outcomes as you expected?
Yes, I think that's exactly what we're expected. Probably some people have higher expectations, but for researchers like us, closely following the situation on the ground, would say that this summit is at least meeting the expectations, in some respect, really beating the expectations, because the expectations going into this meeting were laid very low. So I think at this point, because of the really deteriorating relationship in the last more than 12 months, I think at this time, repairing this relationship and restore that to the let's say, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and also other pandemic hit bilateral relationship is a very positive sign that moving forward, this relationship will move towards a better or stabilizing future.
Mr. Gupta, looking at the development of the summit meeting from the U.S., what's the general response from the public, from the media?
I think there's actually been a lot of attention to the summit. Usually the general headline out here has been about the conflict in the Middle East, and that has been the primary focus. But I think it was completely moved aside, and the focus really was on the summit and on President Xi and President Biden and the state of US-China relations and what it means for the world. And I think there was a welcome attention which was paid to that meeting. And I think both sides understand, and the people and the media understand the value of getting this relationship right. So I was actually fairly encouraged by the response in the media in terms of the coverage of the summit, which until very recently, it has all been focused on the situation in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Warwick Powell here. If you look at the China-U.S. relationship, of course, we cannot say that enough. It's very important not only to countries but also countries around the world. Do you see positive development, or are you full of hopes for the bilateral ties?
Look, I always remain hopeful, if not entirely optimistic, and that's because the relationships between the two countries have headed down a very rocky path for quite some time, and you don't turn that circumstance around with one or two meetings. The real test of this summit is going to be what happens over the next 3, 6, and 12 months. Is there going to be sufficient walk to follow the talk? And the big question mark remains the sincerity, in my view, of the collective West, broadly speaking, and also of the American follow-through. We've seen talk before, not followed up by walk, and a febrile domestic environment heading into an election year could easily derail any of the good intents and high-level consensus that might have been reached at the meeting of leaders.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Gupta, I want your response. Last time around, a year ago for the Bali summit, and there's a very good consensus by the two leaders, but the sense is like there's a lack of implementation, follow-up of that agreement. What about this time around? Do you see there's a seriousness to follow through?
Yes, there's a seriousness, but again, on Bali, my view is slightly different in from the way you framed it, because in Bali they said, we need to set a floor, we need to start emplacing guardrails, and it was a strong consensus, and they didn't have any really deliverables coming out like on, say, fentanyl or US mill, etc., etc. But yes, I mean, and then wanted to start the lines of communication, and of course then the balloon incident happened, and so that sent a chill in ties. But the importance of Bali was that they had such a firm consensus and intention that they did want to move forward, that after a decent interval of that balloon incident, the process that they intended to start in December 2022 was started in June 2023 when Mr. Blinken, when initially, I think in Vienna, Wang Yi and National Security Advisor Sullivan met, and then Mr. Blinken traveled, and Kerry and Yellen and Raimondo and everybody. So the intention of Bali was a strong one, and there was follow through to start initiating those lines of communication, and those were initiated. And so right now, at this point of time in San Francisco, we have the lines of communication operational. We know that there are guiding principles being set, and now there are also some small lower-level deliverables. The next step would be to start harvesting them, to start implementing them genuinely and sincerely, and also trying to maintain the relationship in a holding pattern as the US goes into its election campaign. And with these lines of communication, if there is an issue cropping up next year, then troubleshoot it, and the lines of communication are open. So I think San Francisco is a continuum from Bali, and I think it's the relationship is on a right track, although it is, of course, not going at the pace that we would like it to go in terms of being a more warmer, quicker, faster, and more productive relationship.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this election, of course. Do you think the general election will have any negative impact on the on the implementation of those agreements there?
Oh, we're talking two elections here. One is, of course, the election in Taiwan, which will have impact on how U.S.-China, the triangular relationship works out. And then, of course, the presidential election. I actually do not think they will have that much of an impact unless they get derailed by a serious incident. And we have to understand, we have these deliverables coming out on fentanyl, on Mil-Mil. There's also the potential next year of having another small and important deliverable, which might be the renewal of the US-China bilateral science and technology agreement. So that could be a deliverable. And also, if one reads the climate change statement, which was passed, I think, on November 14th, they're talking of a high-level summit among state and provincial leaders sometime in the middle of next year. So they're trying to ensure that there is momentum going forward so that even if it does get kicked back because of electioneering-related noises in the US, at least there can be stability in the relationship. And my sense is that because these deliverables are lower level deliverables, they're also very actionable even in that environment. And that's why they've not tried to do too much and then trip up. They're trying to do something small, but realize that. And I think that's a good way forward at this time.
Mm-hmm. Zhao Hai, as Mr. Gupta mentioned, about if you look at the deliverables, if you look at, of course, the visits by senior officials, it's sort of like a delayed proper follow-through of the Bali agreement there. And you do see like a solid improving in terms of the tone, in terms of the deliverables. Mm-hmm. And this time around, of course, we are going to see increasing direct flights between the two countries, and the visa application will be streamlined, and then we'll be meeting about tourism, for example. And China is ready, as announced by President Xi Jinping, to invite 50,000 young Americans to China on exchange or study programs in the next 5 years. When you look at the deliverables, first of all, I'm confident that they will be delivered, and the follow-through will be there. And secondly, how impactful that is. What is the intention here if you look at these developments?
If you look at the deliverables, you would notice that those are focused on not high politics, but low politics area, where President Xi emphasized people-to-people relations, young people, local-to-local connections. And those are exactly the two governments focused on right now, because there are many difficulty still exist in terms of trade, technology, and military-to-military relations, and those are hard to crack. And at this point, I think beginning with smaller, low-hanging fruit will be the best choice for both governments. So yes, I believe those will be delivered, and particularly the flights, the students travel to China. But of course, the U.S. needs to lower its travel levels, warning levels on China first. And the other thing is China agreed probably in the near future will deliver more pandas to the United States. And as we all know, that American people really love panda. So I think there are many areas where both sides can increase connectivity and exchanges on multiple levels. And that will bring pressure, I think, back to Washington, D.C., because Washington is using the excuse that now more Americans hold negative perceptions of China to try to capitalize on that negative perception, to say that stand tough against China is somehow gathering more votes for their politicians. But if we change that environment and make more people-to-people friendly relationship presentable, to Washington, D.C., that will put pressure on those politicians and at least change some of the politicians' view about China, about their ability to use that as political capital. And at the end of the day, I think right now Congress is a major obstacle to improve bilateral relationship. It's not just the government. I think Congress needs to be more aware of China's real intentions and the future of China-U.S. relations, because now some of the proposed bills and some of the negative intentions in Congress is really doing potential harmful things on both countries, not just China, but also self-inflicting wounds to Americans as well. So I think that's the importance of this summit, because the two leaders has marked a principle for the future and marked the roadmap for the future, even though right now I think some people may be disappointed about the number of deliverables. The list is probably long enough, but I think with the established mechanisms and dialogues and multiple connections, context, in the future, we will see gradually more fruits will be mature and to get ready for the benefit of both countries.
So Warwick, despite the differences on some, major issues, including on Taiwan, probably, you do see this, the kind of willingness and sincerity from both leaders, from both sides. Let's stabilize our relationship. Let's restart our relationship. With people-to-people exchange. But then there's another factor. How do you see that about this negative sentiment toward China in the U.S.? The percentage is rather high.
The reality is that a lot of this negative sentiment has been caused by the efforts and the resources committed to drumming up the China threat, China fear campaign, heavily funded from Congress. And it's not a sentiment that has just emerged organically amongst the wider population. The fact of the matter is that over the last 20 plus years, the United States has benefited significantly from its economic relationships with China, as has China benefited from the economic relationship with the United States. The challenge has been, so it seems to me, that the benefits, the aggregate benefits to the United States have not been effectively shared and distributed across the body politic. And in that environment, whipping up a China fear, China threat campaign with hundreds of millions of dollars of funding has, it's got fantastic raw material to work from. That's very unfortunate, and it creates significant barriers to overcome in the short term. Hopefully the longer term, we'll see the people-to-people connections starting to wear some of that negativity down.
Mr. Gupta, do you see that as probably one of the biggest barrier in terms of bringing the two countries together, probably, or to gain a better understanding of each other?
Yeah, I completely agree with that sentiment which was expressed. The problem really, it's not been an organic bottom-up process. It has been a top-down establishment-led process to let's try to start tearing up our relationship with China, because in the larger view, US and China are fated to compete. This is great power competition. We can't be too tight with each other. We need to actually be separated. Otherwise, how can we be enemies and compete with each other? And this was the process from high-level establishment trying to create that separation. And that's why it's been so unfortunate. It's not just been in the United States. I would say in most of the Five Eyes countries, which have had conservative or Republican governments, apart from New Zealand, have all gone down this route, and that's why it's been very disappointing in this regard. And that's why the whole process of trying to bend this relationship around to a more warmer trend would necessarily entail more contacts. Of course, COVID also came and sheared some of those contacts between the two countries and the two peoples, and I'm hoping those contacts will start thickening again. And one point I would like to raise also, which we don't pay that much attention to in these summits, and this was actually in the virtual meeting in November 2021. It was at Bali and it has been in San Francisco. Both leaders have tried to reassure the other side with a number of assurances. China says, we're not here to become number one, we're not here to displace you, we're not here to interfere in your politics. And the US has also come back and said things like, we're not here to decouple, we're not here to contain, we keep to our one China policy, alliances are not meant against you, we are not trying to subvert the Chinese state and your system. And yes, both sides don't really believe what the other says because there's a lack of trust, but there's that effort to create reassurances. And it doesn't make sense, I would say, to incessantly parse what each side is saying or trying to believe what the other side is saying. Take it at face value, what they're saying, and on that basis, try to establish a new relationship so long as there's sincerity in the conduct and following through on those assurances. And I think that itself could help stabilize the relationship. And I see the two leaders trying to go down that route, and I think it's a welcome development.
Welcome development. Zhao Hai, if you look at the two countries, Gupta mentioned about the lack of trust and also probably the lack of understanding, as President Xi Jinping mentioned, one of the big issue he has been thinking is really, are we adversaries? Are we partners? Here's a direct quote. This is a fundamental and overarching issue. The logic is quite simple. If one sees the other side as a primary competitor, the most consequential geopolitical challenge and a pacing threat, it will only lead to misinformed policy making, misguided actions, and unwanted results. China is ready to be a partner and a friend of the U.S. The fundamental principles that we follow in handling the relationships are mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. For the Chinese side, it's really about setting the tone. Like what kind of relationship we want to have, and then we do what we need to do. But for the U.S., it's already said it's a strategic competition. Under such a background, probably what we need to do to increase the understanding, as Gupta rightly pointed out, China said, I don't want to be the hegemony. I'm not seeking sphere of influence. I'm not here to dethrone the U.S. But there's a lack of trust there.
Exactly. I think that's why President Xi mentioned that, because in order to build the right house, you need to have the right foundation. Because if the foundation is shaky, then the house is not stable. So I think the difference between China and the U.S. View of the bilateral relationship has been ongoing, because China always emphasized that we need to first have a principle and the vision for the bilateral relationship before we can go into details and discuss exactly how to act on certain problems. But the U.S. side always emphasized in a very much a transactional way to do one thing or another and gradually build on top, one after another on top of another, to build trust. And before they can achieve that kind of trust, they would not agree with China on any principle. So the both sides are actually from a diagonal
different approaches.
But we hope we're moving towards each other, not away from each other. So that's why, just like Dr. Gupta said, it's very important to reassure each other that we're not each other's threats and not challenging each other's fundamental or core interests. So I think that's very important. And the other thing is that I want to emphasize one point, because other than the top-down propaganda, I think pandemic is also very much a factor that in the past 3 years, preventing two countries and two peoples to come closer with each other. Because all of the communication channels and normal travels, as we know, are interrupted. And some of the good ideas, even think tank people, track two connections are severed. So at this point, I think we're just warmed up. People-to-people exchange is just restoring, and we cannot rush this. I think the ice is frozen too deep. We need to gradually warm and reduce the layer of ice at this point. And I think with the right principle, right direction, at least we're consistently moving towards that, and to get rid of those barriers. One thing, one last point is that I think next year people always worried about the campaign, the presidential election, and the attack on China. I think this summit is important because that will give people a peaceful mind, and that at least will reduce the hotness of this issue. And normally you don't see China issue as a top issue in the U.S. elections, because domestic issues always take priority. So hopefully with a more stabilized relationship, the U.S. election will not direct all their attention on the China issue and continue to have a spillover effect on bilateral relationship. And so that other activities, business activities, people-to-people exchanges will conduct normally, not being impacted or affected by the political game in the town of Washington.
Well, Gupta, both you and Zhao Hai mentioned about this is not a bottom-up, it's a top-down issue here. Since it's from the top, are we able to change that? The negative atmosphere?
I think there's going to be difficulty, because let me express what I found disappointing about the summit. And the disappointing part is right at the front, from the get-go, the U.S. side saying we are in extreme competition. It was almost as if it's in a haste to say that, to sort of prejudge the summit outcomes and say, we are in extreme competition, it's just going to be that way. Because if the framing of the relationship itself is different from the two sides, they aren't really rowing in the same direction in that way. And the Chinese side is saying, no, we're not adversaries the way you all are framing it to be. The good point is when, to be adversaries, you need both sides to be adversaries. And when one side says, no, we are not adversaries, it limits how far the other side can treat this side as an adversary. But still, I was a little disappointed to see that framing itself, that there isn't a coherence out there at the highest level. And we see that also, there's not been a joint statement. Each side puts out its readouts. The Chinese side puts out a far greater, more detailed readout, which has a lot more conciliatory talk from the American side to the Chinese, which is not in the American readout. And that's why I'd like to see if they can put together even a joint press statement, not a full joint statement. They've not been able to do so far. And my hope is that at least these are small steps in the right direction, and maybe down the line, if Mr. Biden manages to get re-election, that what has been achieved so far would be a platform for really deepening the relationship in the mid-2020s, because they are getting down to setting those principles on the basis of which they can then transact productively, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Powell, if you look at that, this bilateral relationship here, obviously, it is important, but at the same time, they have differences, different approaches to deal with this relationship. Someone from, say, countries between these two powers, what do you see that? What's your worry? And are you having probably a bit more peaceful mind, when you see the two leaders, shaking hands, with big smiles toward each other, and hopefully things will get better there?
Look, in terms of optics, it's always better for leaders of countries to be able to have civil conversations with each other and to demonstrate a level of bonhomie. But I think the previous panelists actually opened up a very important issue. It's not just a disappointment that there are different framings. I think it actually says something very fundamental about how two countries and two civilizations view the role of major countries in the early 21st century. The US, and particularly the Beltway elite, draw deeply from the well of American exceptionalism and a Manichean framing that sees the world in good guy, bad guy, black and white terms, where relationships are transactional and pitched very much as peer competitor, major power competitor relationships. Alternatively, what we've seen articulated is a view about major national relationships in the context of multilateral collaborative frameworks. And I think the message out of this, and the message that is the hopeful message, is that there are ways in which nations around the world, big, medium, and small, can actually work with each other, not in an adversarial framework as an a priori, but to actually set a framework and a set of principles that begin from the basis of the common ground. And the common ground, of course, is a shared planet, right? And a shared humanity that impacts on the health of our planet and that impacts on the health and well-being of the various peoples of each of the countries of the world. So it is disappointing that this exists, but there is a historical reason why, in fact, these framings are there, and this will continue to be, I think, the source of friction for quite some time going forward.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. With that, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks again to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.